Welcome to this At One with Animals, Conversations to Inspire. I'm Janine Uphaim, and my guest today is the amazing Gail Lash, Dr. Gail Lash. Now I'm just going to read out a very short description of what Gail has done in her short life. So Dr. Lash has been trained in a variety of disciplines: biology, ecology, anthropology, forestry, recreation and tourism, public health, public policy, theatre arts, zoo design, diversity and inclusion, peace education, metaphysics and meditation, animal behaviour and interspecies communication. She has a bachelor's in zoology, a master's in technology and science policy, and a PhD in economics and policy of forest resources. So there you go. So I will share Gail's contact details at the end of in the description of this video, and also the White Lion, Global White Lion Protection Trust's website. As you will probably know by now, these conversations are in support of the White Lions, which is very appropriate, and you'll hear why later. So thank you so much, Gail, for joining me today.
Oh, I'm so happy to be here, Janine. Thank you for asking me to be on your amazing show.
So Gail, what I'm really curious about is what was your childhood like, and what in your childhood led you down this path?
Great question, Janine. So I'm going to start with a little bit of a sobering fact. And that is that my dad was a CPA, so he was a certified public accountant, had his own business, very successful. I grew up in Houston, Texas, in the United States, and he worked a lot with the oil industry and sort of made deals with the cronies in the oil industry. So we had a lot of money. We had enough. I thought I was rich, and I had the country club membership, and we'd go over to the pool and swim in the summer. And but my dad was also an alcoholic. So when he came in from work every day, you kind of I had to read him. I had to know whether it was safe to go up and say, "Hey, Daddy, this is what I did in school," and blah, 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 whatever. Or it's like, "Oops, nope, go hide in my room and pet my dog," and go off and travel in make-believe land with my dog, or with books, or that type of thing. So I fell in love with nature because we had a pond on the other side of the neighborhood that I could walk to and sit with the ducks and feed them bread and be in the nice blue sky and watch the snakes slither, into the pond and just really be in that quiet place that was my peaceful place, that didn't get into the arguments that my parents were having. They, fortunately, it was no hitting, but it was a lot of yelling. And so there was a lot of trauma that way, not peace in the household. And it'll be interesting. We'll get into that, I'm sure, in this interview, that peace is my passion now and creating peace in the world. And, it's no accident. I believe we choose our parents. We choose what we come to experience in this life. And so to have a father and mother who didn't create peace in the house was actually perfect for me. So it really drove me out into nature, into the biology, into learning about the amazing world that we live in, and loving the trees and the water and the mountains. And fortunately, my parents like to travel. So we were able to go up and down the East Coast of the United States, the West Coast, into Canada, into Mexico, and see all the national parks. And I fell in love with nature. I fell in love with the outdoors. And as a kid, I had a little turtle, I guess, and I used to watch the dragonflies the tadpoles, you know, the frogs we had a little tiny, I'll call it a pond. It was just this little kid's swimming pool that they built out of concrete, kind of, that was maybe like, I don't know, 10 feet long and 5 feet wide, you know, out in our backyard that we could go splash around in. But of course, the dragonflies would lay their eggs and the frogs would lay their eggs. So we'd get tadpoles in there because we didn't chlorine it. But so I'd watch all those things, and I love nature. And I had a dog, I had a rabbit. And so I know I talked to nature when I was a kid. I know I did. It was just my solace. And that led me to really pursue a career in biology and learn animal behavior. And then that led me to work with zoos. In Houston, I tried to get a job at the zoo. I did some volunteering, but then they didn't have a position open. So I worked as a pharmacy technician at MD Anderson Hospital, which is a premier cancer hospital, and learned how to be a pharmacy tech. And that was a really good thing to get into just as a backup. But, you know, my dad said, "What are you going to do with a biology degree?" And I went, "Well, that's a good question." You know, what can you do with it? So I always thought zoo. So I worked in the small mammal house at the Houston Zoo, and then in the children's zoo, and helped raise a baby camel and just all kinds of all the animals that you take out to the schools to explain to the school kids what animals are and why we should protect them and their environments and habitats. So it was a great awakening in the childhood of really driving me out into nature and finding that peaceful place for myself.
So what was it that, when you say that you wanted to do biology, what was it about nature and your relationship with nature?
So
doing the
a couple, yeah.
Sorry.
She's wagging her tail. It's interesting. Science is all about predictions. So this is an interesting conundrum. It's an interesting dichotomy of, in science, we talk about having hypotheses and predicting the way tests are going to go. And you kind of, you know, you have your experiments, you know that it can go a couple ways, and you're wanting to prove a hypothesis. So there was that control aspect of it, or that predictability aspect of it, that really appealed to me. Because think about it, in my childhood, in my home setting, there was no control. I could not control my parents arguing and the yelling. And so I wanted to create peace. And so science was very predictable. I could control the experiments. I could go out and be like an investigator, a detective. You know, how is nature going to answer me in this problem? And that's why sometimes, you know, as I say, as a scientist, you can control it, but really nature is in charge. And so you don't know what's, in studying animal behavior, for example, when I was in college, I studied a herd of deer that we were looking at how they use the space and what who grouped with whom in rutting season, or, you know, which females were preferred. And you just get a sense of who the animals are. But it's obviously, as you know, as animal communicators, each animal has their own individualistic free will and personality. And so they choose, they have choice. And that's the important part. So it's, as an animal behaviorist and observing wildlife, it was interesting to see what choices animals made and why that was important to them. And so I think all of that led me into going into animal communication, or learning at least the ways of being able to talk with animals. Certainly in the zoo settings, as I became a zookeeper and animal caretaker, I know that I was talking to my animals, even though I had no language for it, if you know what I mean, or no structure to it, like we do in Winter's classes or any of these other opportunities. But there's that heart-to-heart communication. And if I can tell a quick story, when I was an animal caretaker at the Los Angeles Zoo, I was taking care of the orangutans. And I always used to kid, we both have red hair. So it was one of my favorite species actually to be with. They are so intelligent. They're so amazing. And if I was hurrying to go home, we would bring them in from their habitat at night and give them their evening meal. And it's all people quality food. And, and I have it in these big buckets, and I had to stick it through into trays into their night quarters. And if I was perturbed or rushing, like, oh, I've got to get home, I've got to do this or that, they would not come in. They would stay out. They would just, my energy was like this. And I'm like, come on, and they're like, no way. Yeah. Not until you're calm. and so I learned that I had to step back. I had to, before I even got close to the orang exhibit, I had to calm myself and say, I have all the time in the world. I am going to bring them in. I'm going to lovingly give them their dinner, going to bid them good night, and then I'm going to go home and do whatever I need to do and get to wherever I need to go. So if I did that, they would jump in like, oh yeah, hi Gail, ready for dinner, ready to bed down for the night, blah, blah, blah. So it was just, I learned energy just by watching them and just by being with them. And as I said, free choice that we all had, that they had, and that I had. How can we work together in harmony and peace? So it was a great lesson.
Yeah, they're always trying to help us calm down. And I think, that Maya being here, I still get quite nervous doing these interviews. And Maya's here, stroking the cat, it's like calming. And, you're sharing that story and I'm thinking, yes, okay, I get it. Yeah, no, it's great. And yeah, also being a redhead, I understand the connection to the orangutans. I wanted an Irish setter when I was a kid because of the so yeah,
I love it. Yeah.
Now I have cat hair in my mouth. So, as animal communicators and being in the animal communication world, also, there's a kind of, the animal rights world as well. A lot of people are negative towards zoos. What do you say about that? I mean, obviously, your work in zoos is to make zoos better, but what do you say to people who are negative towards zoos?
Yeah, it's a great question, Janine. And it's very true. There are, before we get into just the conversation of having animals in captivity at all, there are different levels and gradations, if you will, of captive settings. And so many times zoos are terrible. They're just terrible. And so there have been in the last, I would say, 30 years, maybe 40 years. Actually, I guess the Association of Zoos and Aquariums in the United States or North America has been around for, I want to say 75 years, actually. But about accreditation, about, what are the standards for keeping animals under human care? And so now they've evolved to these amazing institutions. The AZA has 241, I guess, institutions accredited, and the animal welfare is their prime directive, along with conservation of in situ sites, conservation of those local settings where the wild animals come from. And these days, normally, there's no going out in the wild rather, and bringing animals into captivity. They're all bred in zoos, so they've only known that. I did a paper in college once on zoo animals, on are they domestic, are they wild, are they a little of both? And what I ended up making the argument for is that they really are both. They have only known that. And some would say, oh my God, that's terrible. Others would say, including Jane Goodall, that she'd rather be a chimp in a captive setting than a chimp in the wild, because they live longer, they're better taken care of, they have health care, they have instant food, they have things to do to keep them, they're in their social setting, appropriate social setting. So nowadays, zoos and aquariums are very conscious of putting animal welfare up at the front, and what can we do to promote this, and using their amazing influence on the public to promote conservation in the wild. And what I say is, I say amazing influence in that, at least in North America with AZA zoos, the Association of Zoos and Aquariums zoos, those 240 institutions, I think bring in, I'm going to say, I don't know how many millions, I want to say 200 million people a year, but I know it's more than all professional sporting events combined.
Wow.
Of people go to zoos and aquariums. So you have an opportunity. Yeah, it's huge. You have an opportunity to reach the urban populations that will probably never get out to Africa or Asia or Australia or, any of these areas that the wild animals actually still exist in the wild, and be able to see them. And so it's an educational opportunity. And so education and community engagement is very top priority as well on these institutions' agendas. So that's, I guess the argument I would make is, yes, we as humans need to be compassionate and interspecies conscious of how we deal with the world, how we live on Mother Earth. And these animals are ambassadors to those populations that will never get to see them. But more than that, they're an opportunity. And this is where my work goes, or wants to go. Zoos are coming along in this regard, but I want them to see themselves as an institution of peace. And what I mean by that is that a way to talk about what are the issues that are creating disharmony between humans and animals in nature. And how can we find solutions to those? And then how can we find solutions just to human issues? So for example, in this last year and a half or so, when we've been in the middle of COVID, it's a lot happened in the United States about civil rights, about Black Lives Matter, and about social justice. And so it was interesting because zoos have tried to stay out of that. Actually, they're not political institutions, and they try not to get involved in the human issues, but they just had to speak up. They actually came with the AZA put forth a national letter that we are here for biodiversity. We're here as a proponent of all life on Earth. And that means all human life too. And that everything is equal, and we support that. And when you come to our institutions, you are supporting the diversity of humanity, as well as diversity of all species.
Yeah.
So it's becoming an opportunity to have a place that is safe, if you will, that is out in a natural setting, because zoos are outdoors, and even aquariums, obviously, they have these beautiful spaces where they're, and we can talk about this later if we choose, about how the habitats are there to mimic the wild, if you will, or be as wild-like as you can. But they, when we get out to nature, our human being, our soul soars. It's just that natural element is something that we need. And of course, I think everyone during COVID being locked in for quite some time really realized that being out in nature is just uplifts your spirit. So these institutions that have animals, these living animal collections, are an opportunity to help people heal and to help people really find that spirit that connects with nature, if they choose to make that part of their mission. And slowly it's going that way. And I say slowly because, they have to bring in the money to feed the animals, and they have to bring in the money to pay the staff. And so there's a lot of, if you will, business-like thought that directors have to and board members have to be aware of to make these institutions run.
Mhm.
But besides that, they're contributing to conservation, they're contributing to local community in service projects and things like that. So anyway, I've talked a lot. Keep asking me questions.
That is the point. No, that's really fascinating. So I have a couple of questions. One is I'd really like to talk about, how mimicking habitat in the wild, because my first thought when you were talking about that was the size, what we think of as the size of a territory for a lion, for example, and how to mimic the size, without actually having that kind of territory. But also, I'm really curious, as to how long you've been, in the zoo industry in the way that you are working now, Tourism for Peace, and how it's changed since you started that. So if you want to answer both those questions.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. So just to go back to the history of zoos, if you will, but they used to start out as menageries, obviously, with the king and the queens, or wealthy landowners or persons that would collect different species and show them off because they're exotic. And then it moved into city zoos. The London Zoo was one of the first zoos in the world and had rows of cages of different animals, again on view as a collection to show the diversity of the planet that people weren't going to see. But they were usually single animals and not in appropriate social settings. And so then it moved back into, I want to say the 1930s, 1940s. Hagenbach came, I'm not sure the dates, but Hagenbach was a landscape architect, I believe, who basically said, let's get rid of the barriers, the bars, and put in like a moat and have these wide landscapes so we can have it more look like where the animals came from. But even then, you would get these grottos. You would get kind of a rockwork back, and you'd get a grassy plain, and you'd get a moat in front, and the animal in the middle. And you go from one to the next, and it still wasn't great, but it did give the animal more natural textures to deal with. And then it developed into more these habitat immersion, where rather than have people lined up on walkways in front of these various exhibits, it was how can we weave the visitor into a landscape that looks like the wild, and then you suddenly turn a corner and boom, you see, your antelope or your gorilla or your tiger, and you're in that same landscape with them, and they could come at you or with you or by you. So you have that surprise feeling like you would in the wild if you were taking a hike. And that happened in the 1980s or so, that type of new zoo exhibit came about. So we've come a long way since then. It became more of how can, rather than zoos have stamp collections, stamped animals, if you will, into how can you do them into, certainly it used to be, well, here's all the felines and here's all the hoofstock and here's all the primates. But then it became more of a ecological grouping of, okay, we've got the South America, or we've got the Australia, or we've got this section of Europe or Asia. What animals live together and how can we show those ecological considerations? So then you have similar plants and landscape or terrains and topography that all species would be working with in that particular location in the world that's being depicted. And of course, one does its best, and I say this because my husband's a landscape architect and I'm a biologist, and we met at the zoo when I was on staff as a zoo biologist helping with construction of these new habitats. And so after all of that happened and we finished with that zoo, we started our own business. So we've been in business for 25 years or more. Gosh, designing zoos around the world and sanctuaries, animal sanctuaries. So when we do this, you use plants. If you cannot use, obviously, the plants from that local area, use something that mimics it, that looks like it.
Mhm.
So if you want to put in an acacia tree from Africa, you can't, because they won't grow wherever you're actually building this habitat, use something that mimics the same size leaves and the same type structure so that the animal can use it in a similar way. And you mentioned size, and we'll get into that in just a moment. But it's about the topography of that particular exhibit, and about giving the animals choice, not always having them on view, which sometimes the public gets really pissed off about. Which is, that you pay your money, you want to come in and see the animals, right? Why can't I have that stamped collection? Well, it's all about training the public. What is it about that you're learning about these animals? And sometimes they hide, sometimes they get behind a rock or a log, or they're way up in a tree and you can't see them. So giving the animals those choices and those opportunities is really important when in designing these habitats now in these captive settings. And ideally, a zoo would have all of those types of structures, and obviously appropriate social settings. So if I'm dealing with capuchin monkeys, I would have 10, 12 animals in a group, and it would be the main pair and their offspring, and you'd have where they were working together. Now, not always does everyone get along. So in designing these facilities, you have to have more than one area, because you might have to splinter a group. You might have to, create another one, or that's why zoos exchange animals, because for genetic diversity, to make sure you're not breeding related animals, there's a whole called SSP, the Species Survival Programs, that has literally every animal listed that is under human care, and what their genetics is, their family tree, and who, if we're going to breed, we need to get them where they're not going to breed with their father or mother or whatever, or sister. How do we exchange and make them so that, God forbid, they would go extinct in the wild, we'd still have a genetically viable population. And that's what the AZA talks about, is these SAFE programs, these SAFE. They are saving animals from extinction. That really is one of the goals of these institutions. How can we take these ones that have, like the California condor, which got down to, I think, 10 animals, 10 birds back in the 1980s, and they were all captured and brought in, and all the eggs were taken and, put in an incubator to make sure they hatched well, and the babies were raised with puppets, humans dressed up as condor puppets, so they never saw a human, so they wouldn't be imprinted on humans. And then they were put back with the parents and put back into the wild. And now the California condor it's still threatened and it's still endangered, but it's back in the wild. I think there's 500 birds or something like that flying around in the western part of the United States. So these are zoo projects. These are projects that they've taken on to help in those extreme instances. I kind of went off on a tangent. So
No.
the space you were talking about, the space, and that is an issue. You just cannot give the animals the natural space that they would have in the wild. And so let's take elephants, for example. It's very controversial about having them in zoos. And it started out, of course, like a circus. You have them in a very small area. And I'll use Zoo Atlanta, where I used to work, in Atlanta, Georgia, in the United States. They had this elephant exhibit that actually was pretty good for the 1950s or 60s. And then the 1980s came along and they said, we need to do a more naturalistic habitat. So they did. They built this with rock work and a pool that the elephant could submerge themselves in, lots of wood and logs and toys. And they had a demonstration with the keepers where they would go in and work with the animal and point out things that they could do and their strength. That's when animal caretakers could go in with the elephants. It was still allowed. and they were gentle with them. I mean, they did use the ankh, but they were doing all appropriate behaviors. No, clown show or whatever. It was all appropriate stuff. And it was a really great exhibit. But then animal welfare standards change, and we learn as we grow as human beings, if you will. And that's a whole nother discussion about our awareness on the planet. That is, our consciousness is becoming higher and more in tune with what is right, what's the right path, and how we can all work together to create a world at peace. So now Zoo Atlanta actually about 6 years ago got an extra 3 acres from the city park from the mayor, and it was an amazing deal. So they expanded the elephant, they moved the elephants completely from where they were to this 3-acre habitat, and were able to put in a bull section and a cow section and make it long and have where they can walk long distances, but they can walk around in a long area. And there's a pool still, and there's rock work, and there's sides and lots of trees and things they can, some things we have to keep them away from, some things obviously you give them to play with and to use and manipulate. But now the animal caretakers are under protected contact. They can't go in with the animals. So they have to do everything outside of with a little barrier there to protect the humans, because more of all the animals in any captive settings, elephants are the ones that have killed more keepers, because they're smart and they're big, and they get pissed off, you're out of luck. So the association standards are no going in with the animal. You have to have protected contact. So every time that a keeper has to work on the feet of an elephant, they train the elephant to lift their foot up and be able to use the like you're shaving a hoof on a horse, work with the foot on the elephant. And anytime they need to take blood or do something, they lean their ear in and they can take blood. And so again, it's all about training and cooperation and choice between the animal and the caretaker to have the best life you can for these animals.
Oh,
and as big a space as you can.
Yeah, it sounds so positive. And when you said the 1980s, that's probably about the time I started to go to zoos, and it's amazing to think back that that's actually when things started to change. Okay, I grew up in perhaps not as progressive as America, but it feels good that it actually started to change then. So I don't think I mentioned in the beginning that you're actually in Belize. So you moved from Atlanta to Belize last year, wasn't it? Last year, last year, yeah. Because I'm just noticing that there's been a couple of birds. Now, you said before there was hummingbirds, but what was that bird just now? Because when you're talking
now, it's a kind of a jay, I think.
Oh.
You hear it? Yeah. He's very noisy right now. What is he saying to us, Janine?
Yeah. I was thinking about the elephants, and maybe it's a celebration. Maybe they're celebrating.
They are
waking up.
They're a bird with a black back and a white belly, and they're pretty, I won't say large, but they're
yeah, really wants to say.
He really is having fun. Yeah, it feels happy to me.
Yeah, I was going to say, it sounds like a magpie, the colouring, black and white.
Yeah, similar.
And jays are related to magpies. They're from the same family, I think. So, yeah.
I still have to learn the birds here. I'm learning, from the sound. The toucans have they make a sound that you can really identify easily. And I love having them around, and the hummingbirds make a click click as we have flowers right outside of our window, and so they come and feast on the flowers every day.
Oh, it must be amazing. Well, it is Central America, right?
It is.
So that's tropical. That's like rainforest or semi. Yeah.
Like it's kind of a low, like a short rainforest. We do have some big trees, but really it's a lot of secondary growth here. I'm right near a river, And right down near the river are the bigger trees, but up on the top of the cliff, this was in the Mayan territories. So there's a lot of Mayan ruins around, actually, little places where you could see they would stash their food and where they had their former houses. And it's, although the Mayan people are still here, I mean, I'm talking about the ancient Maya.
Yeah.
But it's interesting because I guess the area has been used, in other words, and then secondary trees have grown that they're still probably 50 feet tall, but they're not, they're not.
They're quite the height.
They're not the typical rainforest, but there are.
Amazon.
Yeah.
No, that's well, I mean, that's going off on a completely different tangent, but I imagine that's
well, I just wanted to say it was interesting. I mean, just as a side note, coming from the United States and coming to a tropical country where the animals are very, very prevalent. And I'm in the middle of a forest. As I said, I'm on a hill above the river going into the town. The town's only 1.5 miles away, and I can see it from our house, but it's still, we're in the middle of the forest. So we've got a lot of ants, scorpions, we've got coatis, we've got foxes, we've got some deer, we've got all the birds I was telling you about, and I mean, so many birds. And so to have the wildlife right around us has been really interesting, and how to work with it, because obviously some of these creepies I don't want in our house. So I've talked to them and said, please stay out, and here's your limit. You're allowed to be in the garden. You're allowed to be in the forest around us, but you're not allowed on our patios and in our house. And so it's, and there are consequences if you do. And so it's, I mean, it's interesting how we were talking about how humans use nature. And that's the evolution of our consciousness is all about moving into a state where, when we are developing a land, to ask permission of the land and to ask permission of the trees and the animals. And we did that here, actually. And I would love to see where every development has that awareness, and then how are we using the elements like the water and not only the soil, but the water, and are we having that where everyone gets enough water? I mean, that's a whole nother conversation about natural resources, but how do we tune into those elements of the land and sky and, the fire, the earth, the air, the water?
Yeah. What's a Kuwaiti?
A Kuwaiti is it lives in Central and South America, and it is a mustelid. It sort of is in the raccoon family. It has glands that make it smell like a skunk or a raccoon, but it's not that stinky. But it looks like I'm trying to think. It's sort of has a long nose and is low,
like
and has a bushy tail. It's called a Kuwatamundi. Kuwaiti is the short.
Oh, Kuwatamundi. Okay. I was thinking, yes, I have actually met a Kuwatamundi.
Oh, okay.
In Bath. In long story, another time. It's just so fascinating talking to you. You have so much knowledge about zoos, obviously, and it's really. It's very interesting to learn about the development of zoos and how they've changed and how they're helping, like you said, in the States, 200 million a year, how they're helping people change because their enclosures are more authentic, and of course the zookeepers, as they are, because they have their shows where they talk about the animals, so they'll be talking about the animals in a different way, and all the signs around the zoos will be, imparting, snippets of wisdom that actually works for the animals. So I think it's amazing, and it's not a place I had thought of as being you know, in the forefront of waking humanity up. But I actually, now we're talking about it, I feel like it is, absolutely. The zoos that are following this growth, you know, format, absolutely can change, you know, people's, or, you know, upgrade people's understanding of nature and animals. So fantastic and great work. So I know that you've had a part in all of this as well. So yeah, it's fantastic.
It's been fun designing these places for animals to be in, that people can see where the animals come from and who they are as best as we can show the public. And so, you know, it's interesting, as I say about the history, we still have far to go. You know, I talked to my husband and I talked to friends, what would be the ideal zoo? And of course, many say, well, you know, ban them all together, put them back in the wild. But, you know, look at, I'll just use South Africa as an example. The wild is fenced and it's privately owned. So the way humans use the planet is what needs to change. And the way we think about the wild, quote unquote, is what is the next conversation, because we humans tend to appropriate land and make it private and make it belong to someone, to where they have the rights to mine it, to dam it, to, you know, to change the waters, to farm it, to grow livestock on it, to whatever, and or to build a development of houses or buildings on it. And when we don't work together in unity and look at the bigger picture, that's when the problems start to happen. And so obviously our brothers and sisters in the animal kingdom need their homes as well. They need their spaces. And when we give them their spaces, we are also giving the waters space, and the mountains and the glaciers and, you know, all of that. So it's a bigger question, or bigger consideration of how to work together on the planet as human beings, and the way we use the planet for our survival. And not just survival, it's like, how can we thrive? So it's looking at zoos and aquariums are, and animal sanctuaries, which to me, the difference between animal sanctuaries and zoos and aquariums that you normally see in an urban setting is that the sanctuaries do have more space for the animals, usually the bigger, you know, several acres or hectares for these species. And they may or may not have public visiting. Some are open to the public and some are not. And then you get into the next layer, if you will, of like ecotourism, which is what my doctorate's in, my master's and my doctorate are really looking at how people use wild nature for tourism, putting a value on it that then gives revenue back to the local communities so that they will protect those environments. Otherwise, they're going to cut the trees down, or, you know, dam the rivers or whatever, if there's no, quote, value, revenue coming in from that nature. And it's sad to say, but that's very much the way humans think and act on the planet. So we can start to have those larger conversations of, and of course, climate change is bringing those to the forefront as well. And social justice issues are bringing them to the forefront as well, is how do we live in harmony with Mother Nature?
And then I'm thinking of the dolphins in Japan. You know, the Japanese, you know, killing the dolphins because that's how they have survived. That's how their families have survived. And I talked with a dear friend who is Japanese, and she said, you know, it doesn't work that the people in the West are up in arms about these people killing dolphins, because they're driven by wanting to feed their families, you know, and if we don't, or if they haven't found another way to survive, and so and that's when you've you've got to talk to the governments, and the governments have got to be proactive in finding new resources and jobs for those people. And it's not, this is the thing about animal rights, is it's and I think this is what I think, what I come back to all the time, is it's about understanding each other. And yes, we all have to change, but if we start to understand each other and not just say you're doing it wrong, I'm doing it right, you're doing it wrong, then we've got a chance of moving forward. And when I say that, I of course include the animals. You know, my perfect vision, talk about the perfect zoo, my perfect vision for the future is where there's actually a government for animals, where, you know, the animals are you know, part of the conversation. And I, you know, to anyone who's not an animal communicator, that's going to sound like, you know, some complete fancy, like Dr. Dolittle, or, you know, something like that. But you and I know that that's very possible. And I hope that's what's, you know, in the not too distant future, that there is, I mean, there certainly is, you know, people are doing that, but I mean, you know, in a bigger way, in a more public way, in a more accepted way as well, and it not just sort of hidden. And I know animal communication, or the knowledge of animal communication, has come a long way, you know, just in the last 15 years. But yeah, that's my vision, and that that whenever a company uses a logo with an animal, or the name of an animal, that they have to give a percentage of profits, like Jaguar or Mustang, or, I mean, that's just cars, but you know what I mean. When you're using any part of an animal to sell your product, then I think it's just common sense that they should be supporting those animals in some way. Yeah. You've got to put these things out there. You've got to set intentions.
Well, and the conversation in zoos, well, let me back up and say that, for example, every year the AZA has an annual conference, and usually around 2,000 professionals attend it or so. And of course, these last couple of years, it's been virtually, it's been online, which has been really great for us. But trying to travel, you know, not having to travel has been very lucky. But the point is that the conversations have really come into lately about that conservation is very colonialistic. You know, it's a colonialistic mindset, because it means that we can take some of the land or some of the areas away from people and give it to the animals. And I know that's a very yeah, I agree. It's very human-centric way of thinking, and a very, how can I put it, dominant, you know, over animals statement. But because, of course, they were there first, it's theirs. Why are we, you know, giving it back to them? But the point being is that, as you just said, people need to survive. And when you can't meet your basic needs of food and shelter and safety, and even education, that those things need to be dealt with first. And then that will help conservation of animals, or will certainly help animals being able to be seen as the sentient beings that they are, and the cohabitors of the planet that we have to take into consideration, and not just resources that we use. So in many ways, it comes from the grassroots. You know, you talked about going and doing activism with governments. I think, and I'm a Baha'i, I'll just mention that. And in the Baha'i faith, we talk about, really, it's about, as you said, getting to know each other, working and developing these relationships, listening to one another. What do we need to provide for humans to be the amazing, creative, divine beings that we are? So that we can each contribute to the service of society and create a better world, and a world that works for all, not just human species, but every species and every rock and, you know, element, water, and on the planet.
Mm.
And that's where it comes down to, is starting to work and have justice, to have where you don't have such extremes, wealth and poor. You have moderation, and not that everyone has the same, but that those who do have help those who don't, but everyone has enough.
Yeah.
And that's really where the conversation needs to start and happen at the grassroots level, and work up to a new kind of government, as you said, that works for all.
Yeah. When you were saying, and that I said about understanding each other, and I think we actually need to take it further back than that. We need to know ourselves. That's the was it over the temple of Delphi? Is that it? Know thyself? Is that?
Oh, yeah, that's true.
Yeah,
right. You're right.
I think, if you think about shadow work and mirroring, that's what we're all coming up against, is it's the outside showing us what's inside us. And so if we're coming up against the same thing and we're arguing against it, it's actually ourselves. We're not knowing, forgiving, we're not compassionate towards ourselves. So yeah, I mean, of course, everyone's just got to follow their heart, and and then we'll be fine, because then we'll be doing the right thing.
And you're right, Janine, finding that peace inside of yourself, peace begins with me, is like the song says.
Yeah.
So that it has to happen in here before I can then be that vibration out to the world that then can change the world around me, just from me walking in it. And that's what we all are working on.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that's what the animals are helping us remember.
Yeah, I was just exactly. Yeah, exactly. Oh, there's just so many things that we could talk about, but I'm conscious of the time. So I guess we're talking about changing people's perceptions of animals, and obviously a great place to start is with kids. Kids are the future, and they're our future leaders, as Lorraine Turner says. And you are writing a series of books, and Lucy, what is the title of the series?
The title of the series is called Dancing Through the Spiral Gate.
Dancing Through the Spiral Gate. And Lucy is the main character.
Each book is Lucy Adams and, whatever. There's 9 in the series. So the first one is Lucy Adams and the Tablet of Truth.
But you have one, the beginning of one of the books to share with us, to read out. Is that okay?
I do. So let me just preface by saying Lucy is a young girl who lives in Belize, and she's biracial, and her mother runs the zoo there. And it is, the whole series is about developing these human characteristics that we've been talking about, of compassion, of unity, of justice, of how to think about creating this new world of peace. And truly, as you pointed out, Janine, it's really already here. We know what we need to do to create harmony with the animals and harmony with the planet and each other, but implementing it. So each of these 9 books starts with each has a country as a focus and an animal as a focus. And Lucy is to learn the peace powers from these animals, and then come back and teach humanity the peace powers. And so it's a series of a quest of collecting the charms on this charm bracelet, these 9 charms of these 9 animals in these 9 countries with 9 peace powers. And so the first one, this is the first chapter, and I'll just read a page and a half here. So we'll just to give you a flavor of it.
And which book is this?
This is the first one, Lucy Adams and the Tablet of Truth.
Mm-hmm.
And it's set, the main country is South Africa, and the main animal is the white lion. And that would be on the jacket cover, so you would know that already. So, chapter 1, Lion Food. Believe in yourself and all that you are. Know that there is something inside of you that is greater than any obstacle. Christian Larson. Roar! The 400-pound lion snarled at Lucy's face, not 3 feet from her nose, its teeth gleaming in the bright Belizean sun. The 2-acre zoo habitat now felt a lot smaller. Someone had let the lion out while Lucy was cleaning. She shifted her rake handle to the front, her cacao-colored hands stacked on top of one another and froze in place. Kajisu, I know you're new here, Lucy whispered. Your name means peace, so please don't eat me. We can be friends. Yes, little one, you would make a fine meal, your body the size and color of a young impala. A much better meal than the mush patties you feed me. Where are the crunchy bones? The flesh and guts I want. If you want a carcass of bones and guts, I'm sure we can get you one, Lucy said, holding her left hand up in a stop sign motion. I'm sorry you don't like the food. The lion retreated a half step. You understand my thoughts, little human? Then tell me, why do you hold me captive here? Lucy felt her heart race like an impala. All she wanted to do was run, but that was death. Measuring her breath, she answered, You are here to mate with a Malay. Your wild family is gone, shot. Look at your injured foot. Lucy extended her arm to point to his back left paw. Authorities couldn't release you back into the bushveld, so you were brought to our zoo. You are special, Kajisu, Lucy said. You are a sacred lion. You must breed and pass on your genes to your cubs. You are one of the last white lions in the world. Kajisu turned his milky head to look at the walls of his enclosure. This space is big, but it is certainly not the heart of Africa. Pain shot through his eyes and heart. Can this girl be right? The horrors of the human hunting are wiping out my kind and our knowledge of harmony and peace. This wisdom must be preserved and passed on. In solidarity and understanding, a Malay roared from her enclosure nearby. Come with me, Kajisu, back into your boma. We'll feed you a great carcass. We will make your life happy, I promise. You and your offspring will live long with no fear. Besides, Lucy added, if you eat me, you'll be killed too. That would be tragic. Lucy, don't move. Anna Adams ran along the habitat's public wall. I'll get the gun. No, Mama, stay there. Looking into the golden eyes, Lucy commanded, Kajisu, come with me. She took a step toward the boma, turning her back to the lion.
And to find out what happens, you're going to have to buy the books.
I have to finish writing the books, Janine.
I love it. You know, they're so captivating. I'm so there with her, you know. Oh, amazing.
Well, I had to make Lucy obviously a girl who could talk to the lions and who could hear them. Yes.
Yeah, of course. Many years ago, actually, when I left Australia and I went to live in England, I worked as a volunteer at a wildlife park. And I spent time up with the lions up there. So when you're reading that out, I'm there with those lions that I remember so well. Oh, well, thank you. This has been so wonderful and inspiring and thought-provoking. So I'm so grateful that we've had this opportunity.
Oh, I am too. And I just want to add that, you know, I've had the amazing pleasure and gift of being able to go to Timbavati and see the white lions with Linda Tucker. And it is so amazing. They are the sacred star lions, and they are so wise. So I encourage everyone to please, yes, tune in and support the Global White Lion Protection Trust. And if you ever get a chance, you know, to go under one of Winter's animal communication workshops with Linda, then please take advantage of it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's life-changing or inspiring, and it's the place on earth where I feel most connected to my soul, where it's I don't have the words, and yeah, hopefully we'll be able to get back there in the not too distant future. And then I didn't actually say this in the beginning, but you and I met in Wales, I think about 3 or 4 years ago, pre-COVID.
Yes.
And that was a lot of white lion energy there as well. Although we were working with the Welsh ponies at the time, and the dolphins and the seals. So yes, so I do sense different places in the world, even though the lions are only from Timbavati in South Africa, their light is actually in different parts of the world as well. So yeah.
Yes, very much so. And as you said, Janine, we have to keep asking the animals around the planet, you know, what do they want? And they are in, believe me, and as you know, they are in co-creation with us humans to make this a better place. So even though, and as horrible as some of these interactions with humans can be, I mean, there's a lot of things happening around the planet, obviously, that are hurting the animals. It's also bringing to light what needs to change. And so there's opportunities to rectify what has been wrong, and to bring that heart love and into the conversation, and into the prayers, and into the activism, if one can do so, to actually help make these changes happen.
Yeah, and that reminds me, of course, talking about Linda Tucker, but also Andrew Harvey. For so many people, it's just so painful to listen and to hear of stories about, you know, as you say, so many atrocities towards animals. But as Linda and Andrew would say, is allow it to crack your heart open, because that's where the beauty lies. That's where the energy is to actually make these changes. And our hearts were meant to be broken. They weren't meant to be protected. So yeah, a good note to end on. Well, thank you everybody for watching. Thank you so much, Gail. It's been so wonderful.
Oh, you're welcome. Thanks for inviting me.
I will list Gail's website. And do you have a YouTube channel?
I do, the Tourism for Peace as well. It's so I'm in process of putting more things up, but more things will come.
Yeah,
well, it doesn't have much on it right now, but yes, there is a channel.
You can share your new details as they come, and update the description. So yes, so thank you everyone for watching this, and see you next time. Bye for now.